Hello, my name is Meyer Conradie and I am the founder and CEO of Mosaic in South Africa. And it is such a privilege for me to be visiting Hopewell this weekend. And today I want to share a message with you that God has been actually working in my personal life quite a bit over the past couple of weeks. And it's such an honor for me to be able to share this message with you this morning. So before we get started, let's just pray together. Father God, we want to thank you for adopting us into your family. And today we are so just overwhelmed and grateful about this fact that you have made us your children. And it's such a huge honor for us to call you Father and to serve you as our Lord and as our King. Father, I want to pray this morning as we read from your word and as we ponder on what you have said through your Son, Jesus, to us. Father, that you will speak into our hearts and that you will break open this word so that it will become Rhema, so that it will become alive to us. So that it's not just words on paper, but that it may come alive in our lives. I pray it in the name of Jesus. Amen. So today I want to read to you from John 15 and with a specific emphasis on verses 4 and 5. So reading to you from John 15. I am the true vine and my Father is the vine grower. So obviously this is Jesus speaking here. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches, and those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me, you can do nothing. So I brought this branch here, and so looking at this branch, do you think if we all put our best efforts into making this branch bear fruit, do you think we'll be able to do that? Like if we, I don't know, do stuff like, we can probably take a banana and tape it to this branch, but I mean, this branch is not bearing that fruit. And so if you think of how impossible it is that through our works and our efforts that we cannot make this branch bear any fruit, that's how impossible it is for us as Christians to bear godly fruit without being or abiding in Jesus, without being grafted into Jesus. So research from the Barna Institute has found that 50% of American Christian lives do not produce any fruit at all. And a mere 5% of Christians' lives overflow with fruit. So the question that I have thinking about this John 15 and looking at these numbers in the research, what is the difference between these two groups? The group that bears fruit and the group that does not bear fruit. And I'm thinking if what Jesus says is true, that no matter how hard we try, no amount of good works or human effort can make us bear fruit. Or as stated in John 15 verse 4, it actually says, bearing fruit is like producing evidence of our faith. So what I'm wondering, and the question that I'm asking is how does these two groups differ? And what does the 5% of Christians in America that whose lives overflow with fruit, So what do they do? And, what does John 15 say about bearing fruit and not bearing fruit? And so just pondering about all of these questions, I think it's, first of all, good to understand the context of John 15. And so understanding the context of John 15, we need to page back a couple of chapters. And so if you go back to John chapter 12, this is where Jesus is entering Jerusalem, and he's on the back of a donkey, and everyone is recognizing him as the Messiah, as the King, as the chosen one, from God. And then going to chapter 13 is where Jesus is having the Passover meal with his disciples, and such a profound, almost I want to say, moment in the history of our Christian faith is that Passover meal. And at that Passover meal, Jesus is washing his disciples' feet, and he establishes this whole concept of servant leadership. Like, he turns leadership upside down. And I mean, today we are all talking and thinking and writing books and doing sermons on servant leadership. I mean, this is all happening in that chapter 13. And then moving on to John 14, verse 18, Jesus says, he won't leave his disciples as orphans. And so after the Passover meal, and now Jesus is saying this, so his disciples are realizing that things are going to be very different than what they expected. Like, thinking Jesus came into Jerusalem, he's the Messiah, people are almost like worshiping him, Passover meal, Jesus turns the whole leadership thing upside down, and then he changes the narrative. He's like almost warning his disciples that he's not going to leave them as orphans. And, all of a sudden they start thinking, okay, what's going on? And then Jesus and his disciples, they are on their way to Gethsemane. And as they walk through what is called the Valley of Kings, on their way to Gethsemane, Jesus gets ready to share with his disciples his ultimate message. I mean, it's like this climax is building up to this point. Like, what is he going to say, like, in this moment? And what is it that he says? I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. And every branch that bears fruit, he removes every branch in me that bears no fruit, and every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. So if you think of the build up to this moment, it's almost as if Jesus, like, this is probably one of his most profound messages that he can give. And in that moment, what is the profound message that Jesus gives? He talks about him being the vine and us being the branches. And then Jesus differentiates between two groups of people, those bearing fruit and those not bearing fruit. And he says the reason, he explains then in the verses following, the reason is simply because the ones bearing fruit abides in him. They are grafted into him. And I just love how the Passion Translation describes this, what Jesus is saying when he says, abide in me. The Passion Translation says, remain in life union with me. Remain in life union with me. Now, in kind of everyday English language, continually receive, believe, and trust that Jesus is everything we need. Now that we have heard and hopefully we understand at least a little bit about the importance of abiding in Jesus, let's consider what happens to the two different groups. So the first group, bearing fruit, and then the first group not bearing fruit, and then the second group bearing fruit. So if we look at that verse 2, He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. The original word used in the scriptures for this cutting off or removing is actually airo. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, airo or whatever. But that word actually means lifting up and not cutting off. So if you the other context where that word is used, the airo word is used, is in the story of Jesus carrying his cross, and Simon, they call on Simon the Cyrene, and he must airo Jesus's cross. So it doesn't mean cutting off and throwing out. It means propping up or lifting up. And so thinking about this verse that says, he removes every branch in me that bears no fruit, it actually talks about God the Father, who's also a farmer in the analogy of this story. And it doesn't say God will cut us off. It actually says God will prop us up. But what is what is necessary for God to prop you up instead of cutting you off is you have to abide in Jesus. Even when there is just a little piece of us, just a very small piece of us still connected to the vine, connected to Jesus, then God the Father will prop us up. So if you are today hanging by a little thread, like just a little piece of you are still connected to Jesus, but your life is not producing any fruit at all, I want to encourage you that God the Father and the farmer, he's not done with you. He wants to airo you. He wants to prop you up. And he wants to make sure that you get the life-giving nutrients that you need to bear fruit directly from abiding in Jesus. So today I want to plead with you. Turn back to Jesus and let God our Father prop you up. And make sure that you're grafting there, that part of you that abides and remains in Jesus, that it becomes strong and solid. So that's the first group of Christians that's not bearing fruit. And thinking about the research, like that is half of American Christians. And so if you're part of that group this morning, this is my plea with you, is to allow God the Father to prop you up and graft you into Jesus, like solidly. So considering the second group, this is the group that is bearing fruit. Now, the guarantee that we get here in verse 2, it says, every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. So Jesus is saying that if you are bearing fruit, and if you are bearing a lot of fruit, if you are part of that 5% of American Christians whose life is overflowing with fruit, God is going to prune you. Now, pruning does not feel good. But as with the physical vineyard, we also go through seasons of pruning. It's just so necessary. And every time we come out of a time of fruitfulness, bearing a lot of fruit, we will probably go into a time of pruning again. So I've been living in the heart of the South African winelands for the past 6 years. And so literally our entire town is surrounded by vineyards. And we in South Africa, we are just getting out of the winter season, which means right now it is pruning season. And so whenever you drive anywhere, you can see people are working in the vineyards and they are pruning and they are propping up, and so it's pruning season right now. And the reason why so much pruning is necessary, because in the summer, when these vineyards were bearing fruit, they produced a lot of branches. And all those branches need to be cut off to create space for new growth, for this new season that is coming. Okay, so all of these branches get pruned away or cut away, almost to a point where it looks like there's nothing left. It's almost just this. It looks like a dead stick, stick in the ground with branches going sideways, but it doesn't look like anything. But out of these almost nothing vines right now, in the next week or two, the most beautiful green spring leaves will sprout up. And that is literally one of the most beautiful things that I've ever seen. Out of this seemingly dead vineyard, the most beautiful green leaves are sprouting up. So here's an interesting fact about older, more mature vines. Like if you drive past those, the big vines that's, literally this thick, is that the older the vine, the more abundant its branches and leaves are. So it's almost like if a vine is older and more mature, it produces more branches and more leaves. And more pruning is needed for that older, more mature vine. So one might think that with age and maturity as a Christian comes a decrease in the need for pruning. But actually the opposite is true. With more branches and leaves, the vine produces less fruit. Okay, so if you have this old vine and it has a lot of branches and you don't prune it, it won't produce any fruit because there's the sunlight is not getting to the parts where the fruit are supposed to be. So the vine will simply not produce any fruit, or it will produce significantly less fruit. And similarly, in our spiritual journey, we might assume that as we mature in faith, and we become, more mature Christians, we'd require less divine intervention, less pruning. But like the vine, the longer we journey with God, the more we might need His guiding hand to prune away our excesses, our distractions, and our worldly desires. So what's interesting is the older vine's abundance of branches and leaves can actually be likened to the worldly standards we sometimes chase, wealth, status, or recognition. And these can be distractions that prevent us from bearing the true fruit that God desires from us. And the more we're entangled in these worldly pursuits, the less room we have for genuine spiritual growth. And that's why God the Father needs to dig in with these pruning scissors and cut away all those worldly desires. Now the question, and you're probably, hopefully, sitting there thinking, if pruning does not feel comfortable and, it's not fun, how do we embrace this divine pruning process? So in our spiritual journey, there are two processes that God often uses to refine us, and it's discipline and pruning. Now, when we stray into sin, that's when God, out of His loving, good heart, He disciplines and corrects our path. But when we grow, when we seek Him and we strive to mature in our faith, we encounter pruning. Okay, so sin results in discipline, but growth actually results in pruning. And this pruning, when you are growing as a Christian, it isn't a punishment. It's actually a refining process. So being pruned is not a sign of God's displeasure, but rather His commitment towards your growth. It's His way of ensuring that our growth is healthy, fruitful, and aligned with His purpose. So here's an interesting observation, personal observation. I think that one of the most potent tools in God's pruning arsenal is diversity. So when we engage with people who are different from us, we are presented with an opportunity for pruning. Their perspectives can challenge our preconceptions, pushing us to reevaluate and then grow. This diversity is a reminder that no matter how mature we think we are in our faith, there's always room for growth. There's always room for learning. And there's always room for bearing more fruit. So by remaining teachable, by allowing God to prune us, we bear his fruit. We bear the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And while the world, may celebrate the abundance of branches and leaves, status and wealth and all those things, God celebrates the quality and the richness of the fruit we bear. The fruit of the Spirit. So in conclusion, I want to encourage you to take stock of what your life looks like right now. Are you bearing fruit for God and for people around you to enjoy, or not? So if you are not bearing any fruit, or even just a little bit of fruit, I'm pleading with you, turn back to God. Allow God to iron you. Allow him to prop you up and make sure that you are grafted into Jesus. And if you take stock of your life right now, and you think you are bearing fruit, or whether you are not bearing fruit, or just a little bit of fruit, let's open our hearts to God's pruning tools in our lives. And especially, let's be open to the people that God has placed in our lives, the people around us, the people who are very different from us. Because if we allow God to prune us through other people's differences and the way that they challenge us, then we will bear fruit. That's his promise. So remember, pruning does not necessarily feel nice, but pruning is the very thing that will create more fruit in our lives.